the dissemination of inaccurate and misleading information. In this regard, the quality and veracity of the news are important. Emerging technologies, we see that such as artificial intelligence and algorithms have started to play a role in spreading disinformation through digital media, especially. The algorithmic structure of digital media affects the visibility of content that people are likely to engage with. This feature of digital media is, but unfortunately, abused by some actors, especially political actors, particularly through fake support and the use of bots and trolls. Trolls and bots may behave like ordinary citizens on social media, despite that they are fake citizens. For this reason, they are regarded as a persuasive and credible way to spread non-factual content. The power of algorithms and their usage in our daily lives require increasing transparency and accountability to reduce the spread of false information. In the section of the impact of disinformation, we see that digital media creates a wide net due to its unprecedented ability to spread information rapidly in a wide variety of formats. The existence of various forms of content types on digital platforms forces these platforms to evolve quickly and leads to the speedy consumption and the production of information. In this information environment, disinformation can easily lead to polarization, populism, harm to human rights, and more foreign interference in the local politics. As we see that, we said that digital platforms create wide net. It also has the ability to reach larger audiences and enables these audiences to monitor cross-border content and news sources more easily than broadcast media. But this situation leads to the constitution of the creation of the double edge of disinformation. Because on the one hand, while the online sphere provides, for example, governments with a way to spread disinformation far more effectively, on the other hand, false information spread by for example, government and government supporters is increasingly challenged because of the widespread access to alternative sources and fact-checking mechanisms. So that's why we can see that digital platforms lead disinformation to be double-edged in this sense. There are some tools to combat disinformation, such as fact-checking mechanisms, civic capacity building, strategic communication, and media and information literacy. If we briefly explain each one of them, fact-checking has become one of the leading methods today of the responding to disinformation globally. It involves monitoring, detecting, and debunking disinformation during an infodemic period. Its tools are, in this sense, monitoring, detection, attribution, and response. However, it is important, if fact-checking is not used or managed properly, tackling disinformation through fact-checking can be a tool spread disinformation. Another tool is civic capacity building. It is used to strengthen civic capacity in the fight against disinformation and provide consistent funding for initiatives and projects. Civil society initiatives and organizations are progressively utilized worldwide to combat disinformation, often with an emphasis on human rights and bolstering democratic capacity at the local level, especially. Media and information literacy is another mechanism to fight disinformation. The most effective approach is, in this sense, through digital media training. the responsibility is on these individuals who are the middleman between the people and the information. Even small levels of engaging with this kind of media literacy training can improve consumers' responses to disinformation or this kind of propagandas. Although these types of training may take a long time to implement, the long-term efficacy of this tool outweighs the challenges. So it is very effective. Another one is the strategic communication. It is defined as the purposeful use of communication by an organization to engage in the conversations of strategic significance to its goals. The main characteristics of strategic communication are that it is conducted according to a predetermined and systematic plan, not just as a reaction to current or unexpected incidents. Additionally, it includes activities at the strategic, operational, and tactical levels. And lastly, it necessitates the specific definition of the target segments. So these 4 tools are major tools to combat disinformation. Of course, government has responsibility when combating disinformation, because as you see, disinformation operations can influence all sectors of society. Coordinated attacks can exploit vulnerabilities across the government, like cybersecurity, media oversight, health systems, social security systems, and public transportation systems. In this regard, governments must be held responsible to fight disinformation, because it is a big threat to democracy. They should, in this sense, provide organizations dealing with especially disinformation with funding and necessary sources. Additionally, of course, when tackling with disinformation, misinformation, malinformation, the coordination of government institutions to counter disinformation is absolutely and essentially required. Yes, we have come to the conclusion point. We have mentioned what disinformation is, the nuances of misinformation, malinformation, and disinformation. And thirdly, we mentioned the role of digital media and effect of digital media on the spread of disinformation. Fourthly, we mentioned the impact of disinformation and what the double edge of disinformation is. And lastly, we mentioned some combating tools for the disinformation. Thank you for listening.
You are muted.
Ilyas, can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
You can't both speak at the same time because
I can hear you, Ilyas. Can you hear me?
Yeah, yeah, I can hear you.
you can talk now. You can hear me.
Right.
Okay.
Ilyas, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Yes. You can
I
speak.
can't
You
hear
say
Yes, I can't hear you.
you can't have both mics on.
Okay.
Can you
Okay.
hear me?
Let me pose a question to you,
Of
and
course.
then maybe you respond, and we can see whether we can get our technology right. You speak about combating disinformation, countering disinformation. And I noticed a point that you make, which you didn't quite elaborate on, which I'd like to hear more about. How do we seek funding and resources to combat disinformation?
Yes, it's a good question. To find the funding, firstly, government should initiate this kind of operations. If you cannot find from the government this kind of funding, for example, in the European Union, there are lots of project calls. You can apply for this call and initiate some projects. Primarily, these kinds of funding come from transnational organizations and governments, or maybe, of course, you can find some personal funding, but it is very difficult. Also, it is very costly. So in this sense, when we look at the literature, government should initiate primarily this kind of initiatives. Then if the government cannot initiate projects, transnational organizations that deal with and or pay attention to this kind of disinformation issues, information issues, can provide you with funding. I cannot hear you. You are muted.
Speaking, how do you go about fact checking? In other words, who fact checks disinformation?
Can you repeat your question, because at the end, at the beginning you were muted. I could not hear you very well.
No, I was asking you about fact checking. Who does that? How do we go about that? What are some of the mechanisms that we could use as society to fact check disinformation?
For example, any of us can be part of this kind of mechanisms, but especially if this is done through experts on this issue, it of course will be more useful. But main training activities can provide you with the necessary information, can equip you with the necessary information. So of course you need to get access to the source of news. Then you have to be credible. You have to be reliable source. So in this, of course, you need to be funded, because it is, as I said, it requires some tools for the monetization, detection, attribution, and giving response properly. So you have to work in a team. You have to be well equipped to respond and to understand what it is. So you have to have good connections. So if you provide this, if you provide these kind of conditions, fact checking can be done with anyone. Can be done by anyone.
Thanks, Ilyas. Just a final question for now. What would you regard as a difference between disinformation and misinformation on one hand, as opposed to propaganda?
Propaganda is much different. It is mostly it mostly uses factual information, but disinformation is about mostly the false information. With the it actually spreads this wrong information with the intention. Misinformation, as I said, let me check it, what it was. Misinformation is the act of sharing unintentionally false content without realizing whether it is false or not. When we see for example, Twitter posts, we see that many people are the part of these misinformation campaigns, because they do not know whether it is false or not. They share it with unintentionally, this false information. But the propaganda is different in this sense from misinformation and disinformation.
Thanks, Ilyas. We'll get. Morton is a master's graduate. He's a director and editor at Workers' World Media Productions. He worked for the Labor Research Service and also served at the Chemical Workers Industrial Union, which is a COSATU organization. Morton has been an activist for most of his life, and in a manner of speaking, his life revolved around activism in more ways than one, to the extent that at one stage, he also serves as the chair of the board at Cape Town TV, a community initiative. He wrote, produced, and directed the award-winning documentary film, Freedom Isn't Free, the Freedom Charter Today. Morton?
Sorry, my finger's too weak to.
Just hold it.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, thanks for inviting me. And also I have to apologize as I have to leave early. I've got another engagement. But I want to start off from a different angle. The whole question of social cohesion, because the issue of disinformation and misinformation has been posed in relation to presumably interrupting or undermining social cohesion, from what I understand the topic to be. So I think the first question to ask, what is social cohesion? And very simply, it's where members of a community or group feel and experience a common sense of well-being and happiness, right? And unity, where there's obviously minimized conflict between them, minimized social conflict. And I guess, I suspect that the topic might have arisen from our experience of 2022 with the riots initiated by the RET faction, the sabotage, et cetera, which I think most of us in South Africa got a huge fright. We never expected that, and it was quite extreme. But I suppose the question that I would like to ask and pose to everyone, is social cohesion, genuine social cohesion, actually possible or feasible in the society that we live in? So on the one hand, yes, we do consistently have social cohesion in this country and in most parts of the world, but I would argue that it's a very superficial social cohesion. Because genuine social cohesion is virtually impossible to achieve or to exist in the society that we have. And the simple reason for that is that it is a capitalist society with huge class differences and disparities. And very simply, it's about wealth and the differences in wealth and the extent of poverty. So that is the fundamentals of our society. And if we just look at the question of inequality, very simply in terms of statistics, if you look at South Africa, 80% of financial assets in South Africa is owned by the top 10% of the population. Just think about that. Over 80% owned by 10% of the population. And we can probably assume that what we have today, to a large extent, expresses continuity from the apartheid political economy. In other words, that most of that 10% would probably be wealthy white people in South Africa. And of course, over the last 30 years, you had a minority of Black people who are also in those upper echelons of our society. Globally, the figures are even more obscene. 1% own nearly twice as much as the rest of society globally. 1%, the top 1%, those billionaires, own nearly twice as much wealth as the rest of the world. So what I'm arguing is that it is impossible to have genuine social cohesion under those circumstances, right? But social cohesion for those who are in power, those who own the wealth, those who control the economy, the ruling classes of the world need social cohesion in order to continue to exist and to continue to accumulate. So social cohesion for them is vitally important. In other words, they don't want the political economy of most countries to be disrupted or affected negatively in any way. And for that reason, the question of ideas, the media, right, the role of sport is another example. These are all instruments of the ruling classes to maintain a reasonable level of social cohesion to ensure continuity of accumulation of wealth for them, right? And this is where the whole question of misinformation and disinformation enters, as well as things like censorship and selected information as well. So in South Africa, I think if we want to get into a few examples, misinformation, disinformation, if you remember the case of Bell Pottinger, right, and the RET faction, very, very clever, relates directly to my earlier points, because what they used was the reality of South Africa. In fact, there were elements of propaganda, because propaganda really is about, and the introducer was correct, it's about using facts, but for your own cause. And the RET faction did it very, very well. They basically knew what the political economy of South Africa was like, or is like. They know its history. They know about white monopoly capital. That's real. That exists. It has existed for well over 100 years in South Africa. And they use that for their own cause, right? Propaganda mixed with misinformation and disinformation. So that, I think, in South Africa's case is a very, very good example. The other example of COVID-19, which was a global problem, which combined misinformation and disinformation. And it's interesting because I was involved in the COVID-19 campaign, coordinating media and education. And I couldn't understand why, what is the motive? You know, you can, with the RET faction and the Zuma faction, you can understand their motives for doing that, right? But what is the motive for the misinformation and disinformation around COVID-19 and these weird stories about vaccines? I could never fathom that. Maybe someone can enlighten me what the motive is for that. All the rubbish that we got through social media, especially. And the interesting thing about that is that there were or are, and I don't like using the notion of conspiracies, but there were real fundamental problems with COVID-19 and vaccines, right? Vaccine inequality. We know that most vaccines in the first year of COVID-19 went to the Western countries, right? So that global inequality permeated the COVID-19 response. And then, I shouldn't say poor Bill Gates, but Bill Gates was pulled into all of this as the main source of, the main source of the problems and this conspiracy around COVID-19. Generally, my assessment in terms of what I was asked to comment on about community media and even the mainstream media in South Africa, I don't think we have such a serious problem around misinformation and disinformation in the South African mainstream media. But what we do have is selective information, right? And to some extent, censorship, self-censorship, not government-imposed censorship. But so if you look at the SABC, if you look at ENCA, and let me give you a very good example of the issue of Palestine and Israel, right? Recently, we had a Palestinian martyred, right? Without, what is it? Detention without trial, hunger strike, right? It was hardly covered in the mainstream media. But if that was some senior commander of the Ukrainian army under similar conditions in Russia, it would have been big news, right? So it's that kind of thing. If you look at the Daily Maverick, for example, complete Western bias, international global affairs. They're quite good on exposures in South Africa. That's very helpful. But on international news, it's complete Western bias. Okay. On the Ukraine-Russia war, it's simple. Just cut out the EU. I heard the EU being mentioned repeatedly earlier. The EU just banned RT. We don't get RT. They were cut off completely, globally. So how does this fit in with freedom of expression and media freedom? It's obviously a big problem. So for me, those are good examples of self-censorship on the one hand and repression on the other at the global level. I think interesting cases for me internationally also is the BBC in relation to the British ruling class, particularly the Conservative Party and the establishment. So if you look at the case of Jeremy Corbyn, right? Jeremy Corbyn, historically, kind of, I would say, liberal socialist. He's not, I don't regard him as particularly radical, but he promised a lot of good things, right? And he had a lot of support on the part of working class people, the trade unions, and youth. Hundreds of thousands joined the Labour Party with Jeremy Corbyn's campaign. What did the ruling class do? They slandered him. Anti-Semitism, right? And the media, including the liberal newspaper, The Guardian, bombarded this nonsense about Jeremy Corbyn being anti-Semitic and a racist. And eventually, he was suspended from the Labour Party. He's no longer, he's not even an MP, from what I understand. Quite an extreme case, and this is in the heart of Britain, the West, democracy, etc., etc. So there's several of such examples. I think, as I said, for me, the ones that stand out, the Jeremy Corbyn case, Russia, Ukraine, and of course, Israel, Palestine. And probably, yeah, the worst is the case of Julian Assange. You know, if we're talking about misinformation and disinformation, what WikiLeaks exposed was the opposite of disinformation and misinformation. The absolute truth, visually, what they exposed to the world. And here this man gets locked up under terrible conditions. And it's, what is it? This problem, or this case of Julian is going on for about a decade at least. And there's a threat of him being sent back to the US. And we know what can happen to him there. So I think basically it reinforces my point about the notion of social cohesion and the question of misinformation, disinformation, propaganda, and the mainstream media, that in real terms it doesn't exist. And what the ruling classes rely on is their power over the media to influence people to believe that everything's okay and things will be better for you one day in the future. And of course, sport is very powerful in doing that, especially in South Africa. And I think the hope is now that the Springboks are probably going to win the World Cup and we'll forget about load shedding and all the problems. Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks very much indeed, Martin. Your take about social cohesion being superficial. The upper class kind of going with the flow, so to speak, because it suits them, at the expense of the downtrodden in our society. What do you believe is the role of civil society to kind of overturn that trend?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I think the role of civil society, that role was expressed very well in the 1980s. And I know sometimes I get accused of political nostalgia, but the 1980s was a very, very good period that really shook the apartheid regime to the extent that the West applied sanctions against the apartheid regime. And for me, that's largely a result of the high levels of organizations, the building of mass democratic organizations, and strong political and organizational leadership. And unfortunately, for the past 30 years, we've seen a huge decline in that. That's been a massive setback for us. And it explains to some extent why this ANC government, despite all its atrocities and failures and corruption, continues to do more and even worse than what they've done over the last 30 years. It's precisely because civil society is extremely weak. We don't have strong mass democratic organizations. That is our biggest challenge in this period. And for me, that would be the requirement to deal with these questions. Thanks.
As I introduced you earlier, I spoke about you being the chairperson of the board of Cape Town TV. You're probably well aware that the regulatory authority, ICASA, is in the process of registering more community television stations. If memory serves me, there's probably about 19 community stations that are vying for a license at the moment throughout the country. Do you believe there's a role for community television to assist in this whole issue of social cohesion in one way or the other?
Yeah, there is a big role that could be played by community radio and TV. Yeah, it's really a problem in this country. Look, the truth is that Cape Town TV, despite all its weaknesses and so on, is probably the only real community-owned and controlled TV channel in the country, right? The rest have been taken over by interest groups, either religious groups or business groups. And my guess is that, I mean, I didn't know that there were so many applications, but my guess is, because I've seen it from experience, that most of those who are now applying for community TV licenses are probably have commercial interest or certain group interests, like certain religious evangelical groups, etc. So it's not genuine, they're not genuine community TV initiatives. And that's the problem of this country. As we know that corruption has permeated every sphere of the state and society, there's not a single thing, from universities to the railways, to the airlines, ESCOM, every sphere that you can think of has been permeated by corruption. And, you know, I'm not saying ICASAs are corrupt, please don't, but there are those who are applying, these interest groups that are applying, they are corrupt in relation to what's required for community TV and radio. That's really my point. Yeah.
Thanks, Martin. You know, we use the concept of fake news to censor critical and in-depth reporting. And then we get governments in certain democracies that actually promulgate laws to prosecute and imprison journalists. What's your take on that?
Yeah, that's extremely dangerous, and we should oppose it as much as possible. I know with fake news, for example, in the US, I know Donald Trump used to utter this constantly, even though he was probably one of the most guilty of fake news. But I'm against legislating, censoring even fake news, right? Whether it's from the right or the left or whoever. I think laws that curb freedom of expression and media freedom are never good, or hardly ever good in any country. Of course, there need to be limits around expression. Like we know that, you know, pornography, for example, is unacceptable, and having laws against that, that's fine. But generally to try and legislate, for example, against fake news or what's alleged to be fake news, because who interprets what news is fake and what is not, right? So there's a danger in that, and we should never support legislation like that.
Thanks very much indeed, Martin. And it's a pity that you have to leave early. We could have continued the discussion, but thank you very much for your input. Very valuable. Our next panelist this evening is a gentleman called Edwin Cleophas. He has a passion for the youth and the transformation of South Africa. Edwin has a string of qualifications, and I understand that he's currently registered at the University of Stellenbosch for his PhD, and it's to do with sustainability. Edwin has 2 companies, but I'm intrigued by the fact that he is a social justice activist. And through his company, the Social Justice Agency, he collaborates with some civil society organizations to further his interests. Edwin.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. I am able to pin the mic. My fingers are perfect tonight. So I hope that it translates on the other side. Yeah, what the previous speaker said, and thank you for this opportunity to speak here tonight. I think we were introduced at the beginning as the experts. Now, whenever somebody says these are the experts, you should be really worried because there is no such real thing as an expert. Everybody knows there's significant little bit that will contribute to the conversation in order to take us to the next level. That being said, some of us are also qualified and studied in certain areas. And so when we speak, we at least speak with a little bit more authority than somebody who has not entered into that space. Now, the one thing that was not mentioned about who I am through the introduction is that I am the Secretary General for Social Cohesion and Nation Building in South Africa through the Department of Sports, Arts and Culture. So it's a pity my colleague, the previous speaker, has left, because he said what I'm doing in this country is actually worthless. So I wanted us to have a conversation about that. But I think in essence, responding to the topic at hand that we have here tonight with regards to how information is disseminated amongst us as society, the ultimate goal of all this spreading of harmful information or wrong information or explicit information for a specific target or goal, the outcome of all of this is to have discord amongst people. That is why people do it. Yes, we can speak about the fact that Bell Pottinger and all these people were using it for their revenue income and to build wealth and to distract wealth. We can speak about that, but at the heart of it all, the disinformation that was spread amongst us leads to a lack of social cohesion in our communities. How does that happen? We saw with the riots in Durban, when the white people in the still so-called white areas decided that they will protect their own areas. And so our large Indian population were then terrorized by those white people because they felt they had the right to take up arms and protect themselves. Now, at the heart of all of that, we will just say it's racism. But it started with that mis and disinformation that was spread from the start, and it pinned 2 groups up against each other. Similarly so, with the racism during apartheid, colonialism, there was this misinformation that Black people are not human, they're inhumane, and people of color don't have the same ability as white people. We are still living in that same milieu where that informs everything that we do in society. We still held by that same standards, and so we educate ourselves and we work hard towards forming social cohesion in our communities because we are trying to get away from that concept, that ideas that was spread and that sits in our psyche and in our spirits and who we are daily. Now, as government, because that is who we represent when we are trying to socially cohese people in communities, government has a specific role to make sure that everybody in society is happy. Now, they have not succeeded in that. I can see on your faces you are not happy, especially with government. Fortunately, I am not all of government. I am just a small part of trying to achieve that in community. So we are an arm going out to community and trying to achieve that. It's almost impossible for government to make everybody happy in society. It's literally is almost impossible. And now my colleague that has left spoke about civil society. Now, yes, we can say that civil society is very weak, but I can also make the argument when we look at the amount of work that civil society has become responsible for outside, I do not think they have time to worry about political power. More often than not, it's a small minority with money like Akca that can go and fight on these big platforms. Majority of civil society, including myself doing the work, we are feeding the people, the homeless, we are housing people that don't have, and we are trying to build youth in our communities that have lost all hope for a future in this country. So there isn't really the space for them to come alongside the political power that we saw in the 80s. Because remember, in the 80s, politically enforced democracy was run through a unification against one enemy. We all were fighting white power, so it was easy to unite. Now we are fighting hunger, housing, inequality, economic empowerment, racism, discrimination, corruption. The list is long. We don't have one enemy, we have a host. And what does the people do in countries with power, like in the West? They come and help us to fight even more amongst us, because now they give certain people money to make more problems in our country. And we do not see this because we are too focused on each other to look at who's actually trying to get us to fight the whole time. I think it's very critical that they keep us fighting the whole time and apart. Because in my opinion, when we do get to that final point where everybody starts realizing that we are stronger together as a community, stronger together regardless of our differences, stronger together looking at the enemies that is coming in to spread these misinformation and disinformation amongst us, the propaganda and all of that. When we see all of that for the first time and we speak to each other about how we combat that, it is the end for capitalism and these super rich people that controls the world, the power and the money. So they have to keep us fighting the whole time. I mean, look at this world that we're living in today. We fight over the slightest thing. The wrong person walk into a community and it looks different, it's over. You can't explain why you're here, it's trouble, you know? So we are so sensitive to our differences so that we can constantly be in a bickering, in a fight, in something. And how is that spread? Through the media. Our media is never at any point democratic. Whenever you listen to you look at the bigger TV stations like your ENCA, and it's all most of the time propaganda. They are serving one master, the master of money. They are serving that. If they're making money and they have enough propaganda, they're happy. But our biggest enemy is ourselves being ill-equipped and uneducated to see through their nonsense. And so what we hear, we digest, we take as fact, and then we build our consciousness, our ideology, and our worldview around that nonsense. And so when I get into the company of people, I already have an idea of who they are because I learned it through the media, the newspapers, you know, the SON. In colored communities, the SON is the aunties in the colored communities. If they read the SON, yeah, they are 100% informed about anything, politics. You can come there with your PhD and talk about your research. It's nonsense. The SON said it's nonsense. So similarly, the Voice, you know, SON is northern suburbs, and in southern suburbs, the aunties read the Voice. But it's similar nonsense, misinformation, disinformation, that one, yeah. So my final point is that we want social cohesion to be the key in all our communities. However, until our communities become actively involved in their own destiny, we will continuously be fooled by politicians and business people and the West and whoever else, because we are too lazy to educate ourselves on the critical issues that joins us together. And so we ingest everything that people give us, and we continue to be, and that's how I will always have work, because there's always going to be a struggle for us to come together. And so I will always be invited to bring us together. So that's a good thing. I hope to be out of work at some point. I'm hoping 2020, 50, if I'm still here. But it probably won't happen. But when we at least sit in circles like this and we share this information, we are hopefully one conversation closer to understanding what it will take for us to live in a stronger society as a united nation, where our differences enhances what we do and not divide us according to what is happening currently in society. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Edwin. I like your openness and your frankness and your courage to speak out. Very important in our country in this day and age, especially. You talk about the media not being democratic and full of propaganda. I'm not going to mention names, but if you had your own television station today, what would your programming look like?
Well, you will all be tuned in. It will be a lot of comedy, because we need to laugh a lot. I mean, otherwise we'll cry all day if we really looked around us. So there will be a lot of comedy, you know, stand-up comedy, and just aunties telling us jokes that they... True that. However, on top of all of that, we will definitely have more of these discussions, less so with people of expertise sitting here, but more so of groups of people just coming together and sharing information on my channel specifically about their lives and who they are and where they come from, because this is why we can't relate to one another, because there's this fear of the unknown. So until I understand who you are, where you come from, and why it is important for you to be in this room tonight, I cannot really relate to you. And when we bear our inner, that is when we connect as people. And we never have real time for that, because in most instances, it's touch and go, and we never engage again. So my TV channel, it will be comedy, current affairs through the community, and obviously I am a man, so lots of sport.
Where's the room for political satire?
It's comedy. Comedy is political satire.
Thanks. Thanks for your sporting response, Edwin. What do you believe is the direct impact of disinformation and misinformation on social cohesion?
I think I touched on it to some extent. What it does is it keeps us apart. You know, we have the apartheid spatial planning, where we live in our own nooks and crannies and our corners and so forth. So if you spread that information, depending on the platform that you use, you'll know exactly who you're reaching with that information. So what you do through that avenue is to strengthen our disengagement with one another. So that information will just persist in making sure that we never breach that gap between color, religion, sex, or anything else that divides us. We will never breach it, because spreading of that information keeps us to ourselves and our own. Remember, I don't know if this is controversial or anything like that. It might be seen in a religious way, but in the days that have gone by, we were a lot more close to each other and connected, because we frequent places where we met each other, and we mixed and things like that. When we moved into this new democratic South Africa, we became more individualistic and shunned away from society. So now, before, if the community was doing well, everybody was well. Today, if me and my house is okay, then I am okay. So and it was deliberate. It was deliberate. That was a Western thinking that was enforced on us, because we were very tribal as people of Africa. We were tribal. We lived together. We knew our neighbors. We knew the new neighbors' children. We always tell that joke about any auntie could beat us. You know, now it's abuse. You're not allowed to say that. But we were fine when they were beating us when we were younger, because we turned out okay. The auntie didn't beat us until we were dead or broken or whatever. She just, when she caught us doing nonsense, but we were a community, we were a village. You go into history, that is how the First Nations lived. That's how we lived, until this idea, this Western idea of individualization and the family and only me and mine. When that was disseminated amongst us, that's how we became divided as communities. So I think if we're going to be more empowered through that and not accept that divide that comes through the mis and disinformation, we need to get back to and it's going to be difficult, because we see how, especially if you take it at community level, per community, some communities are better set up and it's easy to connect. You know, you have the older people walking together, you have the younger people going to youth together at church, some play soccer in this community, that. But then some communities, there's so much violence, so much abuse, so much corruption, so much poverty, that it's impossible to even think about social cohesion, because there's too many problems to solve. But I think if we come together and unite around this one idea and concept that we are all South African, and that's our basis, we can then build from there.
Thanks, Uncle Edwin. Our fourth panelist this evening is Shafiq Morton. Shafiq, I know your name from many, many years ago. And so when you say you're an award-winning photojournalist, well done again, author and a radio host for over 40 years, that is saying something. Okay. Shafiq has also published 6 books, including biographies. He's traveled to many places around the world, and he's working on a book, and I have to look at my notes. It's entitled, or should I say titled, Circle of the Saints, Stories of the Khamats of the Cape. Khamats, sorry. Khamats of the Cape. Shafiq Morton, nice to have you along.
I'm going to hold the mic. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Edwin, I appreciated what you said, and I liked your positivity. I'm going to talk purely from a media perspective, from a community media perspective at that, and make several observations along the way. Being in the media, I'm full of bullet holes, because we're the messenger, and as I say in the classic, shoot the messenger and not the message. Yeah. But to sort of frame what I'm going to say, I'm not going to be talking about misinformation, malinformation, or disinformation. I'm just going to be talking about bad information and the challenges that we have to deal with as journalists, and also operating within the digital space, which in the last 10 years has moved forward at a pace that is actually quite frightening. You know, you go and look at artificial intelligence, chat GP, whatever they call it. You can write a book in about 3 seconds. It's really scary. But the challenges that we have to face in the media in terms of the digital era is there's a dichotomy. The first one is you've got fact. Okay, fact can become propaganda. But until fact is proven, until it's proved, it remains as propaganda and it remains as unsure. Then you have opinion, which is about 99.9% of social media, actually. An opinion is something that is totally unproven. And it's opinion that causes the panic situations that we can see, that we saw about COVID-19, for example, and the scenarios that we have to deal with. I'll give you 2 practical examples. On a daily basis, I have to answer an email or a WhatsApp from somebody asking me, can I validate, is this a true story? Yesterday, it was the SABC license saga. people having to pay money for car radios, license fees. That was a good one. Today, it was Panado or paracetamol giving us something called a Machupa virus. Never heard of it. Tomorrow, I'll probably have to deal with a rumor that Ramaphosa has become a lizard or something along those lines. Okay, right, bad choice. So on a daily basis, our problem is actually information and the quality of information that we have to deal with. And this plays directly into what we would very loosely call social cohesion. Because when people become disturbed by what they are receiving on their Android apps, it reflects in society. You get this nervousness, this angst, this anxiety, which is not healthy. So in the media, our responsibilities are immense because we are the people that have to try and sort out this information, and we have to find out, is this fact? Is this fact supported, or is it just mere opinion? And this is happening to us 24/7. You know, when I was first in journalism, we hardly had any problems with what you could call fake news. We knew everything that was uttered by the mainstream media in this country, the Cape Argus, Cape Times included, was a bunch of lies during apartheid. It was very easy. The lines were very distinctly drawn in the sand. Post-apartheid, and obviously with the onslaught of the digital era, it's become extremely difficult because it's the quantity of information that we have to deal with all the time. It's just mind-boggling. And anybody in the media today will tell you that in 3 hours, you've got 300-400 WhatsApp messages. You're constantly having to delete on your email all the stuff that's coming in. So how do we actually deal with this? And as a media practitioner, how can I talk to social cohesion? There's several observations I can make. And the first one is that the public is not a fool. The public is not an ass. South Africans are not stupid. And this is one thing that I've learned from the poorest of the poor communities to the wealthiest communities where people actually think. Because unfortunately, wealthy people don't think very much because they think that their wealth is a barrier against adversity. It's not. But that's the reality that they think that they live with. So at the end of the day, as I say, we struggle to put out the right messages. We struggle to put out the facts, what's happening in Russia, what's happening in Ukraine, and working within community media, we have an even bigger responsibility because we actually have more freedom than the mainstream instruments who are bound to commercial interests. For example, I work on a platform where I can talk about Palestine quite freely. I can talk about what the hell is going on in Ukraine, what is really occurring in the back streets of America, where homelessness in the United States is a pandemic and it's not being reported on. It's just being glossed over, for example. You know, things are happening in the world. And from a community perspective, all I can say, it's our responsibility to try and excavate what the truth may be, because at the end of the day, the way things are, how are we even guaranteed to know exactly what the truth is? So for me, as a media practitioner, it's not a question of disinformation, malinformation, or whatever, or propaganda, or whatever it may be. We just have to try and look at what we're dealing with. Is it a fact or is it an opinion? And I think that civil society in South Africa is absolutely vibrant. I don't know where Martin came with that point. I have utmost respect for his views. On a daily basis, I interview probably 2 to 3 NGOs. Why do I do this? I don't like talking to politicians anymore because they lie through their teeth and then through the back of their heads. They just simply cannot be trusted anymore because their self-interest becomes the national interest. So it's through the lenses of the NGOs and the civil society that we're actually beginning to get the truth of what's happening in South Africa, not politicians. And we have to support them. Give money to NGOs, go to their meetings, listen to what they've got to say, because this country at the moment is being run by NGOs. I mean, I did a biography of Gift to the Givers. I know how the organization works. You would be shocked to know how many ministers have got Imtiaz Sooliman on speed dial. It's unbelievable. A government that should be negotiating the freedom of one of its citizens has to go to an NGO to do all the negotiations. And the NGO has better contacts than government, who is totally paralyzed as far as this is concerned. It's been a long evening. I think I'm going to sort of leave things hanging there. I could carry on talking forever, but I would be far more interested to hear questions or whatever the case may be, because I've had a long day and I'm sure you have as well. Thank you very much.
Much appreciated, Shafiq. I'm just going to make your day a little longer. I released a book in 2021 called Reflections of the South African Media, 1994 to 2019. And Jeremy Thompson, the former senior anchor at Sky News, wrote my foreword, which I'm thankful for. And in the foreword, he talks about false stories traveling faster than real news, on one hand, and sort of a double whammy, if you will, that it takes a long time to debunk falsehoods and conspiracy theories. Your take?
Yeah, I think, Robin, you've already answered the question for me, but I will answer it. In fact, the truth of the matter is fake news doesn't cost anything. Disinformation, how much does it cost? Just tell a lie and put it out there. And I mean, I've seen people canceled in 5 minutes on social media, literally wiped out through falsity. And the sad thing about it is that somebody comes at you with something, we have to now go and check it. And the checking process doesn't always take 5 minutes. Sometimes you've got to call somebody, you have to check a lot of websites. And, when you're checking for fake news, you just don't go to one source. You go to as many sources as you can to make sure that you yourself are informed and you're talking sense. So that's the challenge, that bad stuff travels far more quickly than good stuff. And if it's fake and it's sensationalist, if you are trying to sort of get the truth of the matter, it becomes a huge challenge. And I think it's a challenge of our times. And I urge every single person in this room, you can make a difference if you see something that's fake in social media. Respond to it and actually put it out on your platforms. This is wrong, this is fake. And you'd be amazed at how many people you can actually put their minds at rest by actually doing this, as opposed to us poor hacks in the media, like scrambling around day, noon, and night, trying to put out fires. Because sometimes I wonder, maybe I should have joined the fire service rather than becoming a journalist.
Shafiq, if I could just stay with you for a moment as well. There's a question that's come in from one of our viewers. Can AI-based tools be used by fact checkers on social media? By fact checkers or social media companies to combat misinformation, disinformation, or malinformation?
Okay, yeah, here now the word expert is very loosely used because now I'm going into a sea of ignorance. I'm very new to AI. ChatGPT, I'm still trying to get my head around it because as somebody who tries to write, somebody comes along and pushes a button and in 3 seconds I've written the book we've been trying to write for 3 years. It's a bit scary. I think AI is like a gun or it's like a knife. It can cut both ways. It can do good and it can do bad. And I think the challenge going forward with AI is how are we going to use it? And are we going to be able to have instruments or mechanisms in society to make sure that good can be done as opposed to bad? It's the old-fashioned question.
Can I say something? On AI, I want to.
I'll come back to you, Edwin. You do also have a question, so don't worry. Don't feel lonely. Shafiq, I have to ask this question, and just pleasure to have you on the panel. It concerns me that you sometimes get journalists in our country relying on stories being posted on social media and using them as fact, whether it's print, whether it's radio, or whether it's television. Your take?
Yeah, I mean, here we're going into one of the problems of media and journalism is that newsrooms have been a killing field in terms of the retrenchments and people losing their jobs because of COVID and because of other factors, too many to mention here this evening. The sad fact of journalism today is that a lot of journalists are under a lot of pressure. Newsrooms have shrunk. But at the same time, we've got young people in newsrooms. They mean well, but they don't have any institutional memory. I mean, you find reporters who don't even know what the Constitution is about or can't even remember who was the last apartheid president, as a stupid example. So as a senior journalist, so-called, it's really challenging in terms of all these processes. And this is yet another challenge in the media world, that there's a lot of laziness in journalism, and I have to be honest enough to admit it. A lot of PR companies will send a newsroom a press release, and the PR companies are very smart because it's ex-journalist anyway. And what happens is the journalist puts a name at the top and the story is printed ad verbatim on a website or in a newspaper. This is terribly dangerous and terribly wrong. But I'm a dinosaur. There are very few of us left who can still remember the old way when you had to check everything, or in fact, double check, triple check everything. So yeah, one of the biggest challenges is that. And again, as citizens, I think it's part of your responsibility to demand the highest standards from our newsrooms across the country.
Thanks, Shafiq. I know you've been waiting patiently, Edwin. Just sort of to add to what you want to say about AI, there's a question that's coming. There's a comment and a question from Andre Naidu. The rise of AI to mislead, skew information, statistics, etc. Could that technology be used in swaying national voting numbers in all countries of the world?
I think definitely so. That's the quick answer is definitely so. AI is going to be very instrumental in what we do in the future. And yes, part of it is very scary. Two things I want to note about that is one, IOL, probably most famous over the last year, was the 10 babies that we all were waiting for. The babies have still not been found. And so we patiently wait until the mother bring 10 little boys when they are 3 or 4 and show us in South Africa. But we were on the map. We were on all the global stations. And that is just the one story where we can show the impact of how that this malinformation spread across the world. Now AI. Now this is where I have a bit of a two-sided feelings about this, and it's not. I'm not a dinosaur, so there's still a lot of me around. So you'll find a lot of us there. And when I look at AI, I'm optimistically afraid and excited. I know ChatGPT. I cannot write books, but I can now. And I think it's exciting because there's other value to AI where it positively contributes to society. The worst thing about that is, and it is this way with everything else, like the question that was asked, will it influence elections? Will it do negative things? Now, when everything was built initially or developed at the beginning, the intention of that development was for good. Drugs was made to fight illness, and then people became drug addicts. So AI was developed so that we can better be equipped for what we are struggling with currently in the world. At some point, somebody is going to turn that around, make a lot of money to make it something negative, but that was never the intention. So I am not completely on your side, Shafiq. I love AI. I've been dabbling into this for the last couple of months.
It'll be a bestseller.
It will be a bestseller. I'm waiting for ChatGPT to tell me what my title of my book must be. But I mean, other than that, I'm ready to write it. Thank you.
Thanks, Edwin. Perhaps we can get Ilyas back on. Ilyas, I hope you heard my question to Edwin about AI. Do you want to respond to that?
Actually, I agree with the idea that AI can be used in a bad way or in a good way. It was a great example that drug was first used for fighting illness, then it made people addicted to it. So it depends on how you use it. Of course, today it is inevitable for us. We need to use it in a very useful way. It can facilitate many things in the future, and it has already facilitated many things in our daily lives. So of course it can affect everything, but it depends on what in what way you use, who use these tools. So in this regard, it needs to be verified, controlled, maybe by independent, responsible teams or experts or this kind of groups of people. So in this way, it can be used in a better way.
Thanks, Ilyas. Ladies and gentlemen, as we draw closer to the end of our session, I want to give Shafiq an opportunity for concluding remarks. I'll come to you, Edwin, and then we'll finish up with Ilyas.
Well, first of all, thanks to Turquoise Harmony Institute for hosting something like this, and for all of you actually sitting through what some of us had to say this evening. Very brave of you. Just in conclusion, I think that it's very good that we have platforms like this to make ourselves aware of what the challenges are, and I think also the way forward. And I'm not a pessimist at all. I have a lot of faith in South Africans, in South Africanism. And just my final comment is that in terms of social cohesion, and this was a question I put to the politicians, and they go glassy-eyed when I point it out to them. And I've told this to all the parties. I say, listen, guys, water, electricity, roads, housing are not political problems. When are you people going to sit together in the same room and realize that these are South African problems? We're a developing country. Development issues should be the news and not your petty infighting. But when I point out to them that it's a South African issue, it's almost as if they don't want to accept it. Then the one party goes whiny on the other one, and the other one accuses the other one of this and that. So that's a bit depressing. But at the end of the day, what we're talking about in terms of social cohesion is not political problems, it's South African problems. And the sooner we realize this, the sooner we are going to make progress in terms of socioeconomic upliftment and in terms of social values.
Mine is very simple. Social cohesion and nation building is not necessarily the responsibility of government. Government do not live amongst us. They live in areas where we can't even access them. That's how high the walls is. So social cohesion and nation building, more often than not, is our responsibility as South Africans. So the call to action and how we move forward from this for the people in this room and anybody else that hear this statement is to move beyond our limited understanding of our fellow country people and start learning more about each other, become more informed about who we are and how we came to be as a nation. And I think once we learn a little bit more about the person sitting next to you and you give some of yourself to that person, we then become the South Africa that people have been talking about for a very long time, but will never exist until we bridge that gap. So mine is simply to say, look to your left and your right, take a little bit more time with that person, and then we are already starting that process of social cohesion and nation building. Thank you.
Thank you, Edwin. Before I get to Ilyas for his final remarks, are there any questions from the floor? Or comments? Yeah. Sorry, just for the sound.
So I thoroughly enjoyed today's conversation. I was invited by my wife. I actually had a meeting, which I actually decided not to because I was just enthralled with the topic. So I'm just going to make a statement because this is very close to my heart because of the intention behind humanity. And my intention is to serve from a sense of goodness. And it has many definitions. And I think the information that was shared has very much, has different paradigms. And my statement that I'm going to make is that the pen is mightier than the sword. And that has a lot of meaning and can be contextualized in so many ways. But it's basically the start of conversations.
Thanks very much for your comment. Ilyas, the final word.
First of all, thank you for the invitation. At the beginning, I was surprised because I knew that I will speak in the second place. So I was in a kind of shock mode. So thank you for the invitation. First of all, it was my first webinar. It was my first time as a speaker. And it was held in South Africa. It was a great opportunity for me. For this issue, of course, I can say some things, but other panelists, I think, summarize very well. But the point is, I think, which is important, is that if you know the thing that you are struggling or etc., you are not afraid. If you are not afraid, you know how to fight. We should consider disinformation in this context. So we need to know what disinformation is, malinformation is, misinformation is, in what ways they can be used. So if we know these issues, we are not afraid and we know how to fight. So I think this is the important point and need to be considered by everyone. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ilyas. There you had it, ladies and gentlemen. If they thought they were not experts about 1.5 hours ago, I think they're now experts in some shape or form. I like what Shafiq said earlier on, or should I say in his concluding remarks, is that the conversation has started. Let's keep the pace. Let's continue to talk to each other, to our friends, our colleagues, our neighbors, the person who looks different that comes into our community. Let's try to embrace, let's give people hope. Let's be positive. I think that's very, very important. But, you know, it's not about talk. It's about the walk. And that's critical. I just want to end off by saying, let's all become anti-social activists. And you're all wondering what I'm going to say next. Let's become anti-social activists to the notion of disinformation and misinformation. And let's become activists to social cohesion. Amen. Thank you, everybody, and thanks to the Turquoise Harmony Institute. Keep well. And incidentally, if you're a mother, and this is not fake news, happy Mother's Day on Sunday, wherever you celebrate.